The sun was just starting to dip behind the mountains as the rancher rode slowly back to his home. The familiar sight of the sprawling ranch made him feel both comforted and burdened. He had worked this land for years, and while his hands were strong and calloused from the hard labor, his heart was weary. Life had never quite gone the way he expected. He had money, land, and respect from the community, but none of that could fill the emptiness he felt inside. His greatest sorrow was something that no amount of hard work or wealth could fix: his inability to father a child. For years, he and his wife had tried, but it never happened. No matter what the doctors said, nothing worked. It had been a silent struggle, one that he rarely spoke of, even with his wife. The silence between them grew over the years, and they both retreated into their own worlds. The ranch became his only companion, and the days blurred together into a routine of cattle, crops, and long, lonely nights. That evening, something unusual was happening in town. The local saloon was hosting a poker game, an event that only came around a few times a year. The rancher wasn't much of a gambler, but he felt a strange pull to go. Perhaps it was the prospect of a distraction, something to break the monotony. Maybe he just wanted a change, even if it was a small one. When he arrived, the saloon was bustling with the usual crowd, rough men with weathered faces, wearing the same dusty clothes from the ranch or the road. Some had the glint of mischief in their eyes, while others just looked tired. A few familiar faces nodded at him, but no one seemed particularly interested in a conversation. The rancher made his way to the poker table, where a few others were already seated. The stakes were high that night, but what caught his attention wasn't the money being wagered. It was the man sitting across from him. The man was a known gambler, one who had traveled through town on several occasions. He was older, with a grizzled beard and a sharp smile that never seemed to reach his eyes. There was something unsettling about him, and the rancher couldn't quite put his finger on it. Still, he took a seat, settling into the worn chair, his boots heavy on the floorboards. The game started, and for the first few rounds the rancher played cautiously, folding more often than he liked. But with every card that was dealt, he felt more at ease, more connected to the game. It was a distraction, after all, and that was all he needed at the moment. He didn't care much for the money, though it was a good sum, enough to make it worthwhile. What he wanted, what he craved, was the thrill of winning something, anything that would take his mind off his troubles. As the game continued, the atmosphere grew tenser. The players were more serious now, their eyes darting from their cards to the others at the table. But the rancher remained calm, focused. He had always been a patient man, and tonight was no different. The other players seemed to sense this, and slowly, they began to wager more aggressively. The pot grew bigger with each round, and the rancher knew it was time to make his move. The man across from him, the gambler, smiled knowingly as he placed a large stack of chips in the center of the table. "How about a little more?" he asked, his voice smooth and calculating. "How about we raise the stakes? Let's make this more interesting." The rancher didn't respond immediately. He studied the man's face, trying to gauge if he was bluffing or if he was truly confident in his hand. The gambler had a way of making people second-guess themselves, but the rancher wasn't easily swayed. He pushed his chips into the middle, matching the bet. He had a good hand, and he wasn't about to back down now. That was when the gambler made an offer that shocked everyone at the table. "I've got something here," he said, reaching into his coat pocket and pulling out a slip of paper. "If you win, you get this. It's worth more than money. I'll even throw in a little extra just to make it more interesting." The rancher raised an eyebrow but didn't say a word. The man slid the slip of paper over to him. It was a bet that he didn't fully understand, but the gambler was clearly trying to make a point. "What's this?" the rancher asked, his voice low and steady. The gambler leaned forward, his smile widening. "I'm putting up a person, an auction of sorts. A teenage girl. You win, she's yours." There was a moment of stunned silence. The other players shifted uncomfortably in their seats. No one spoke, and for a second it felt like time had stopped. The rancher's mind raced, but he couldn't quite process the words he had just heard. A girl. What kind of wager was this? But as the silence dragged on, something shifted inside the rancher. He had always thought of himself as someone who respected life, who valued human dignity, yet here he was, sitting at a table, involved in a game where a person's life could be the prize. He wasn't sure why, but the thought of winning this bet, of having someone he could call his own, felt like it could fill the emptiness he'd been carrying for so long. With a slow breath, he pushed more chips into the center of the table. "I'll take the bet," he said, his voice steady but with a hint of something else, something deeper. The gambler's eyes gleamed. "A wise choice," he said. He dealt the final round of cards, and the rancher played with a calmness that surprised him. He wasn't just playing for money anymore. He was playing for something far greater, something he hadn't realized he needed. When the final hand was revealed, the rancher's heart pounded in his chest. He had won. The gambler's face darkened, and he reached for the slip of paper with a sigh. "It's done," he said. "The girl is yours." The rancher stood up, his mind spinning with the implications of what had just happened. He didn't know what to expect, but as he left the saloon, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just changed forever. When he reached home, he wasn't sure how to explain what had happened. His wife was already in bed waiting for him in silence. She didn't ask about the poker game. She didn't ask about the money or the winnings, but there was something in her eyes, something he hadn't seen in years. She was waiting for him to say something, to explain, but all he could do was sit quietly by her side, thinking about the girl who now belonged to him. The rancher sat in the quiet of his house, staring at the small slip of paper he had won in the poker game. It felt like a strange, twisted kind of dream, one he couldn't quite wake up from. The girl, the teenager he had won, was now in his life. Her name was Maria, and though he didn't know it yet, she would change everything. The days that followed were filled with strange, unsettling silence. The rancher couldn't shake the memory of that poker game, the gamble, the man's offer, and the sudden responsibility that had been thrust upon him. He wasn't sure what he was supposed to do next. He had always been the one in control, the one making the decisions. But this was different. A human being, a young girl, was now part of his world. He had no idea how to treat her, how to explain what had happened. Maria had been taken to a small cabin on the edge of the ranch. She was quiet, and when she spoke, it was only in soft, hesitant words. The rancher had made the decision not to send her away, but neither did he know how to bring her into his life. For the first few days, they said nothing to each other. He focused on his work, and she stayed in her small room, barely leaving. It felt like a strange, awkward truce between them. He watched her from afar, noticing the way she kept her distance, always looking down, avoiding eye contact. She was young, no older than 15, with dark eyes that seemed to carry a story of their own. There was something about her that made him feel both protective and guilty. He had won her, but he wasn't sure what kind of life he could offer her. He had nothing to give her, nothing except the ranch and the solitude that came with it. It seemed like too much, and at the same time, not enough. Maria seemed to sense the rancher's unease, and over the next few days, she started to adjust to her new surroundings. She would help with the chores around the ranch, cleaning the stables and tending to the garden, though she never spoke much. When the rancher would offer her a meal, she would accept it quietly, never looking him in the eye. It felt like a fragile kind of peace, one that neither of them knew how to break. The rancher found himself thinking about her more often than he liked. He wondered about her past, what had brought her to this point in her life. He couldn't imagine the kind of hardships she had faced, but he knew they were deep. And it wasn't just the hardship of being won in a poker game that troubled her. It was the silence in her eyes, the way she seemed so lost. The rancher felt something stir in him. He wasn't sure if it was pity or guilt, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he should do something more for her. One evening, as the sun set and the stars began to fill the sky, the rancher decided to speak to her. He had been working in the barn, and as he made his way toward the house, he found her sitting on the porch, staring out into the distance. Her face was calm, but there was something about her posture that made him pause. She was waiting for something, maybe for him to speak, maybe for her future to reveal itself. The rancher took a deep breath and walked over to her. "Maria," he said gently, sitting down beside her. "How are you holding up?" She looked at him, and for the first time her eyes met his. There was no fear in them, just a quiet sadness. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned her gaze back to the horizon. "I'm fine," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. The rancher didn't believe her, but he didn't press her. He didn't know how to comfort her. Instead, he sat in silence beside her, both of them staring at the vast open space before them. For a long time, neither of them said anything. The rancher wasn't sure what to say next, and Maria seemed lost in her thoughts. It wasn't until later that night, when the rancher was finishing up his work, that Maria approached him again. She held a basket of freshly gathered herbs, offering them to him without a word. The rancher took the basket from her hands, surprised by the simple gesture. "You didn't have to do that," he said, looking at her with something resembling gratitude. Maria shrugged, her eyes downcast. "I wanted to. I've worked on farms before. I know what needs to be done." The rancher smiled a little, surprised by how much Maria had been able to accomplish in such a short time. She wasn't just a girl sitting in a room waiting for something to happen. She was strong in her own quiet way. He began to wonder if perhaps she wasn't as lost as he thought. "Thank you," he said, his voice softening. "You're doing more than I expected." Maria nodded, but she didn't smile. She wasn't looking for praise. She was simply doing what was needed. Days turned into weeks, and the rancher began to see small signs of Maria's growing strength. She wasn't just a girl who had been handed over as a prize in a poker game. She was someone with her own will, her own dreams, her own past. Slowly, the rancher started to respect her in a way that he hadn't expected. He could see that she wasn't just waiting for someone to save her. She was making her own way, despite the circumstances that had brought her here. As time went on, the rancher began to feel an odd kind of connection with her, one that he couldn't quite explain. He began to see her as someone more than just the girl he had won. She had become an essential part of his life, helping him with the daily tasks on the ranch. And though they still didn't speak much, the silence between them had become less uncomfortable. It was as if they had reached an understanding, a silent agreement. The rancher, in his own quiet way, began to feel a responsibility for Maria. She wasn't just someone he had won. She was someone he had to protect. He couldn't explain why, but he knew that whatever happened, he couldn't let anything happen to her. But even as he felt this pull toward her, he kept his distance. There was a boundary between them, something that neither of them knew how to cross. The rancher wasn't sure if Maria saw him as a protector or as someone who had simply brought her here out of some twisted sense of fate. But he knew that he couldn't undo what had happened. All he could do now was try to be something good for her, to help her in ways that didn't feel like pity. And so, the days passed, each one unfolding in its own quiet rhythm. Maria continued to work alongside the rancher, and the two of them grew used to the silent understanding between them. Neither of them had the words to explain what was happening, but they both knew that things were slowly changing. For the first time in a long while, the rancher began to feel a flicker of hope. Hope that perhaps life, despite its strange twists, could still offer something good. As the days turned into months, the bond between them deepened, not through words but through actions. Through quiet moments of shared understanding, the rancher no longer saw Maria as someone he had won in a game. She was becoming a part of his life, and in return she was slowly beginning to trust him. Neither of them knew where this path would lead, but they both understood that whatever happened, they were no longer strangers to each other. The rancher woke early the next morning, the soft light of dawn creeping through the windows of his small cabin. He could hear the usual sounds of the ranch, cattle moving in the distance, the whinny of a horse, the chirping of birds. But today, something felt different. There was a sense of change in the air, something he couldn't quite place. He stretched, groaning slightly as his stiff muscles protested, and pulled on his worn boots. It had been weeks since Maria had come to the ranch, and each day seemed to blur into the next. Yet there was something in the way the world felt today that made him pause. Maria had been with him for a little over a month now, helping with the chores, silently becoming a part of his routine. The days were long, the work never ending, but he felt a shift in the air, as if something was on the verge of happening. He made his way outside, rubbing the sleep from his eyes as he walked toward the barn. Maria was already there, her small frame working diligently to clean the stables. She had a quiet strength about her now, one that the rancher hadn't expected. At first she had been shy, reserved, but now she moved with purpose. She was no longer just a girl. She was a young woman, strong and capable, taking ownership of her responsibilities. The rancher watched her for a moment, admiring her resilience. He hadn't realized how much she had come to mean to him. She had become a part of the rhythm of life here, as much as the wind that blew through the open plains, or the horses that ran freely across the fields. He stepped forward, clearing his throat, but Maria didn't turn around. She didn't need to hear him. She knew he was there. She had learned to move in a way that allowed her to work quietly, without drawing attention to herself. But this time the rancher spoke anyway. "Maria," he said, his voice gentle but with an edge of uncertainty. She looked over her shoulder, her dark eyes meeting his. For a moment there was nothing but silence between them, just the sound of the barn settling and the occasional creak of the wind. Then Maria spoke, her voice soft but steady. "Good morning, rancher. What can I do for you today?" The rancher hesitated for a moment. He wasn't sure what to say, how to express the unease that had settled in his chest. There was something he needed to tell her, something that had been weighing on him for weeks. But as he looked at her, he realized how much she had grown, both in strength and in character. She had become someone he trusted, someone who had earned a place in his life. "I wanted to talk to you," he said finally, "about everything, about what's happened since you came here." Maria straightened, setting the shovel down with a soft thud. She looked at him intently, her eyes searching his face for something. She didn't speak at first, just watched him, and the rancher could see the weight of her thoughts in her gaze. "I know it's not easy," he continued, his voice rough. "I'm not sure what brought you here, what kind of life you had before, but I want you to know that you're not just here because I won a bet." Maria remained silent, her face unreadable. The rancher felt his chest tighten, unsure if he was saying the right things. He was trying to make sense of it all, to understand what had happened, what was happening between them. But it felt difficult, too complicated for words. "I don't know how you see this place," he added softly, "but I need you to know that I'm not just keeping you here out of some kind of obligation. I want you to feel like you belong." Maria looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "I don't feel like a prisoner here," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I feel safe. It's not what I expected, but it's enough." The rancher let out a sigh of relief, though he didn't fully understand what that meant. For the first time in weeks, he felt a small weight lift from his shoulders. It wasn't much, but it was a start. They continued with their work, and the day passed much like any other. But as the hours stretched on, the rancher couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed between them. Maria wasn't just a girl he had won in a poker game anymore. She was someone he was starting to care about. She was becoming part of his world in a way he hadn't anticipated. That night, as the rancher sat at the dinner table, he noticed something different. Maria had prepared the meal, and though it was simple, bread, beans, and a small roast, there was something about it that felt more like home than anything he had eaten in a long time. The warmth of the meal filled the room, and for the first time in a long while, the rancher felt a sense of peace. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with gratitude. "This is better than I could have made." Maria smiled, a small, quiet smile that seemed to touch her eyes. "I'm glad you like it." They ate in silence, but it was a comfortable silence, one that spoke volumes. There was no awkwardness between them now, no more uncertainty. They had settled into a rhythm, and for the first time in months, the rancher felt like he was not alone. As the evening wore on, the rancher found himself growing tired. The day had been long, and the work had been harder than usual. He stood up to leave, but before he could head for the door, Maria stopped him. "I need to tell you something," she said quietly, her voice soft but serious. The rancher turned back to face her, his brow furrowing. "What is it?" Maria took a deep breath, looking at him with something new in her eyes, something raw, something honest. I'm pregnant." The words hit the rancher like a sudden storm. His heart stopped for a beat, and his mind scrambled to catch up with what he had just heard. He stared at her, unable to fully comprehend the magnitude of what she had just said. "Pregnant?" he repeated, his voice hoarse. Maria nodded, her face pale, but there was no fear in her eyes, just a calm acceptance. "I didn't know at first. It's been a while now. I'm not sure what happens next, but I wanted you to know." The rancher felt his mind racing, trying to make sense of everything. For a moment he didn't know what to say. He had never imagined anything like this happening, never dreamed it would come to this. He had been infertile for so long that the thought of becoming a father again seemed impossible. But as he looked at Maria, the words that had been building up inside him finally broke through. "You're not alone," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'll take care of you. Both of you." For the first time since Maria had come to the ranch, the rancher felt a wave of hope. He didn't know what the future would hold, but he knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't let her face this alone. They would face it together, and with that something deep inside the rancher shifted. The emptiness he had felt for so long seemed to fade, replaced by something new, something that had been waiting for him all along. The possibility of a family, of a future that he could never have imagined. The days that followed Maria's revelation were filled with quiet contemplation. The rancher couldn't shake the news she had given him. He had always felt the weight of his infertility, the sense of loss that came with not being able to have a child of his own, but now it was as if the impossible had happened. Maria was pregnant, carrying a child that, against all odds, might just change everything. The rancher had spent his whole life tending to the land, to the animals, and to his daily routine. He had built a life that was steady, predictable, and for the most part solitary, but now everything felt different. There was an energy in the house that hadn't been there before. It was a quiet energy, something unspoken but felt by all, and it made the rancher wonder how he had ever lived without it. For days he didn't know what to do with himself. He would work around the ranch, lost in thought, his mind constantly returning to Maria. He thought about her growing belly, the life she was carrying, and how much had changed in the short time she had been living with him. It was hard for him to believe how quickly his life had turned upside down. She had been a stranger, someone he had won in a poker game, and now she was someone who had become vital to his life. She was more than just a young woman who had come to help on the ranch. She was becoming part of his family, whether he was ready for it or not. Maria, on the other hand, seemed more settled in herself. While the rancher struggled with his emotions, Maria had found her place. She continued with her chores, working alongside the rancher, never asking for anything, never complaining. It was as though she had accepted her situation without hesitation. Her quiet strength was something the rancher admired, but it also made him feel like he needed to step up. He wasn't just responsible for her now. He was responsible for the child she was carrying as well. One morning, the rancher found himself standing outside, looking over the vast expanse of land he had spent so many years cultivating. The morning sun bathed everything in a warm glow, but the rancher couldn't shake the feeling that he had been standing still for far too long. He had always worked hard, but it had been in his own world, his own routine. But now, with Maria carrying his child, the rancher realized that things were changing in ways he had never imagined. As he stood there, he could hear Maria's footsteps behind him. She had come outside to join him, and as she approached, the rancher turned to face her. There was a calmness in her eyes now, something that had grown since she first arrived. She no longer looked like the frightened young girl who had been brought to the ranch by force. She had found a place for herself in the world, and it was clear to the rancher that she was no longer the same person. "Are you okay?" Maria asked softly, concern in her voice. The rancher nodded, but his mind was still clouded. "Just thinking," he said quietly, "about the future." Maria didn't say anything at first. Instead, she simply stood beside him, her gaze following his as they both looked out over the land. It was a peaceful scene, green fields, grazing cattle, and the distant mountains. It was a beautiful sight, and the rancher couldn't help but feel a sense of hope rising within him. He had spent so many years feeling empty, feeling like something was missing, but now with Maria by his side and the baby on the way, he could see that things were finally falling into place. "I never thought this would happen," the rancher said, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and uncertainty. "Not in a million years." Maria turned to him, her eyes soft but strong. "Neither did I," she replied. "But here we are." The rancher let out a deep breath, his shoulders relaxing. There was something comforting in her words. They didn't need to say anything more. They both understood that this unexpected journey was one they would face together. It wouldn't be easy, but it would be theirs. As the weeks went on, the rancher and Maria continued their work. There were challenges, of course, more than either of them had anticipated. The rancher's wife, who had kept her distance for so long, began to notice the changes on the ranch. She had always been a quiet, distant woman, but the pregnancy seemed to awaken something in her. She started to talk more, to become more involved in the ranching process. It wasn't an easy adjustment, but it was one they were all making together. At night, after the work was done, the rancher would sit with Maria and his wife, and they would share a meal together. It wasn't much, just simple food, but it felt like a new kind of family. There was laughter now, something that had been absent for so long. The rancher couldn't help but feel grateful for the changes that had come, for the way his life had started to open up. He was no longer just a man working alone on a ranch. He was a father, a husband, and a protector. And for the first time in his life, he felt like he had something to live for. One evening, as they were sitting together after dinner, the rancher looked at Maria, his heart swelling with emotion. He had always thought that a family was something far beyond his reach. He had believed that he was destined to live alone, to carry the weight of his infertility as a constant reminder of what he could never have. But now, with Maria and the child, everything felt different. There was a chance, an unexpected, miraculous chance, that his life could be full in ways he had never imagined. Maria seemed to sense the change in him, and she looked up from her plate, meeting his eyes. For the first time since she had arrived, the rancher felt truly seen. Maria wasn't just a young girl living on his ranch. She was a woman who had been through her own struggles, someone who understood the pain of loss and the hope that came with new beginnings. And now they were bound by something deeper than just the circumstances that had brought them together. They were connected by the future they would build together. As the evening wore on, Maria excused herself, saying she needed to rest. The rancher watched her leave, his heart full. He knew that this wasn't going to be easy. There would be challenges ahead, struggles that they would have to face together. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of peace. The future was uncertain, but he no longer felt afraid. In the days that followed, the rancher began to make plans for the future. He started to think about the kind of life he wanted to create for his family, about the ranch and how it could be more than just a piece of land. It could be a home, a place for them to grow, to thrive. He began to realize that the future wasn't just about him anymore. It was about all of them, working together to build something meaningful. One morning, as the sun rose over the horizon, the rancher stood at the edge of the field, watching the cattle graze in the distance. Maria came up beside him, her hand gently resting on her stomach. The rancher looked at her and smiled, feeling something deep within him shift. He didn't know what the future would hold, but for the first time in his life, he felt ready to face it. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but it would be one they took together. And in that, he found a strength he never knew he had. The rancher looked at Maria and his unborn child, and for the first time he understood what it meant to be truly alive. The future was theirs to shape, and he was no longer afraid of what it might bring. They were ready to face it together, no matter what came their way. The days seemed to stretch on, but the rancher no longer felt the same emptiness that had haunted him for years. With Maria by his side and the baby on the way, the weight of the past seemed lighter. The ranch that once felt like a lonely place was now a symbol of something far greater: family, hope, and new beginnings. Maria's pregnancy was moving forward smoothly. As her belly grew, so did the bond between them. The rancher found himself spending more time with her, helping her with the heavier chores as she became slower with the added weight of the child. Despite his own confusion about what was happening, he couldn't ignore the growing connection he felt with her. She wasn't just a girl he had won in a poker game. She was becoming an essential part of his life. One crisp autumn morning, as the sun began to rise over the land, the rancher stepped outside to find Maria standing by the barn. She was holding her belly protectively, her eyes soft with anticipation. The rancher approached her, his boots crunching softly on the ground. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. Maria smiled faintly, though there was a trace of unease in her expression. "I think it's time," she said, her voice steady but with a hint of nervousness. The rancher's heart skipped a beat. He had known this moment would come, but the reality of it suddenly hit him. "Are you sure?" he asked, stepping closer to her. She nodded, looking at him with a mixture of hope and fear in her eyes. "I've been feeling it all morning. It's time." Without a word, the rancher took her hand gently and led her into the house. He had never been through anything like this before, and though he had no idea what to expect, he felt a deep sense of responsibility for her and the baby. He had promised her that he would take care of them, and now was the time to keep that promise. The hours that followed were long and difficult. The rancher stayed by Maria's side the entire time, holding her hand, offering water, and trying to comfort her in the ways he knew how. He had no training in childbirth, no real knowledge of what she was going through, but he did his best to be there for her. As the afternoon wore on, Maria's breathing became more labored. The rancher could see the strain in her face, but there was a strength in her that took him by surprise. She wasn't afraid. She was focused, determined, and steady in a way that calmed him. They were in this together, and for the first time in his life, the rancher didn't feel alone. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, There was a loud cry. The rancher's heart surged with emotion as he heard the sound of the baby's first breath. Maria, exhausted but smiling, looked up at him with tears in her eyes. "It's a boy," she whispered, her voice shaky but filled with wonder. The rancher couldn't believe it. He stepped forward, gazing at the tiny, wriggling bundle in Maria's arms. The baby was small but perfect, his tiny fingers grasping at the air, his face scrunched up in the way all newborns do. The rancher felt a wave of emotion wash over him. This child, this tiny human being, was his. He had never imagined that he would experience something so profound. Maria looked up at him, her eyes filled with exhaustion but also something else, something that was hard to name. It was relief, joy, and an unspoken understanding that they had just taken a huge step into the unknown. The rancher felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders, but it wasn't a burden. It was a gift. The next few days were a blur. The rancher had to adjust to the rhythm of caring for a newborn, and Maria, though still recovering from the birth, proved to be an incredible mother. Her instincts were natural, and she cared for the baby with a tenderness that melted the rancher's heart. Watching her with the child made him realize how much he had underestimated her strength. She had come to him as a stranger, but now she was his partner in every sense of the word. The rancher spent his days working the land as usual, but now there was a new energy in him. He found himself looking forward to returning to the house at the end of the day, eager to see Maria and the baby. The quiet house that had once felt so empty now echoed with the sounds of life, the baby's cries, the soft rustling of Maria as she moved through the house. It all made the ranch feel like a real home. As the weeks turned into months, the rancher found himself falling deeper in love with both Maria and their son. He had never believed that he could experience the kind of joy he now felt. The ranch he had worked for so many years was no longer just a place of work. It was the foundation of a family. And the family was growing, not just in numbers but in love and understanding. One afternoon, the rancher stood outside, holding their son in his arms. Maria was standing beside him, her eyes bright as she watched her husband with their child. The rancher looked out at the land, taking in the fields, the barn, the animals grazing in the distance. It was all the same as it had always been, but it felt different now. There was a purpose to it, a reason for the long days of work and the sweat that poured from his brow. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about creating something meaningful. "Look at him," Maria said softly, her voice filled with admiration as she gazed at their son. "He's perfect." The rancher smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "He is," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "He's our future." In the months that followed, life on the ranch continued to evolve. Maria and the rancher worked side by side, raising their son and tending to the land. Their days were filled with routine, but there was a comfort in it. The ranch had become a home, not just for them, but for the family they were building. The rancher had once believed that his life was destined for solitude. He had come to terms with the idea that he would never have the family he had always wanted. But now with Maria and their son, he saw the truth. Family wasn't just about blood. It was about the people who cared for each other, who built something together no matter how unlikely the beginning. Maria, too, had found a new life. She was no longer the frightened girl who had been won in a poker game. She was a woman with purpose, a mother who was shaping the future of her family. Her quiet strength had become the backbone of their home, and the rancher admired her more than he could ever say. One evening, as the sun began to set and the sky turned a deep orange, the rancher stood by the fence watching the cattle graze in the field. He held his son in his arms, feeling the weight of the child's small body against his chest. Maria stood beside him, her hand resting gently on his arm. "This is it," the rancher said, his voice filled with contentment. "This is everything I've ever wanted." Maria smiled, her eyes filled with a quiet understanding. "And more," she whispered. The rancher looked at their son, his heart full. He had never thought he would experience such joy, such love. The future was no longer uncertain. It was theirs to build together. And so the rancher's life was forever changed. The emptiness he had once felt was replaced with a deep sense of fulfillment. He had a family, a real family, and that made everything worth it. The journey had been unexpected, filled with challenges and surprises, but in the end it had led him to a place of happiness he never thought possible. The ranch, once a place of solitude, had become a home. A place of love, hope, and endless possibility. And for the first time in his life, the rancher truly understood what it meant to be alive. He wasn't alone anymore. He had Maria, their son, and a future full of promise.